to some extent, what I was going to say has already been said, which is a very great advantage. So I should be able to keep within my 15 minutes. I'm most grateful for the invitation. I come to Paris fairly often, but always to talk about North Korea. And so clearly the North Korean issue has been solved, and now let's turn to a more difficult one, the South China Sea. I haven't worked on the South China Sea much in recent years, but when I first joined the Foreign Office in London, I worked on it quite regularly, right up until I retired in 2003. It was a very different South China Sea issue, or set of issues, that we looked at in the 1970s. And I've been interested by some of the assertions that have been made here about claims and counterclaims and maps and lines and so on. Essentially, it was an issue that one was aware of. There was a dispute in the South China Sea. Sorry, let me move this closer. There was a dispute in the South China Sea, but it wasn't one that concerned Europe very much. It was true that there might have been a French claim to some of the Spratly Islands, or certainly to the Paracel Islands. No, it's not Spratly, sorry, the Paracel Islands. And there was a certain ambiguity about, from the French Foreign Ministry at that point, about whether that claim had actually passed entirely to Vietnam or not. There was a British claim. How many people, in all honesty, knew that the British claimed Spratly Island in the South China Sea? Not many people do, but British ministers were reluctant to give it up because of the oil and gas that might be found there. This is in 1956, it's in 1966, it's 1974. How much oil and gas has been found there even to today? Think about it. But we finally gave up our claim in 1974. And looking then at other claims to the South China Sea, the Foreign Office legal advisor who dealt with East Asia concluded that there was only really one valid claim to the southern part of the South China Sea, and that was the Chinese one. We're not talking about lines on maps now, we're talking about territorial claims, and that there was a Vietnamese claim to the Paracel Islands. But the strongest claim of the two, for all sorts of reasons, was the Chinese. Now, that was just one lawyer's opinion and would not necessarily be the same today. The South China Sea in those years was not an important maritime route. Despite the account this morning of submarine researches through dangerous ground and the other areas of the South China Sea, in practice, people still followed the hydrographic maps and charts that were available, which all, at that stage, still delineated the South China Sea as a very dangerous place for shipping. And indeed, if you look at the names of many of those rocks and reefs, you can see the evidence of that. Most of those names were given not by ships calling there, but by the ships that were wrecked on them in the 19th century. So that was the origin of many of the names. So this was not an area of great economic importance. There was another factor in this at the time, which was the fact that there was a war in Vietnam. The United States was involved in the region. And some of you may remember that for many, many years, the Chinese issued serious warnings to the United States about aircraft intrusions into their airspace. I once counted up the relevant proportion, I now can't remember the details, but the relevant proportion of those claims that related to Chinese protests at flights over the Paracel and over the Spratly Islands, and the vast majority of those protests about American flights related to those islands. So here was something else. The United States, if I remember rightly, and I may have got this wrong, but the United States did not actually take a position on the dispute in the South China Sea. Okay, come forward now to today. We have multiple claims, even if many of them are very tenuous and latecomers to the game. The oldest claim, apart from China and Vietnam, the oldest claim is that of the Philippines. And put in its modern form, it dates from about 1957. And it, in turn, was based on the occupation of the islands by somebody who was part American, part British, but lived in the Philippines. It wasn't in the views of the British Foreign Office a very strong claim. The Malaysian claim, the Brunei claim, all come much later. There was no handover of a British colonial claim to Malaysia, which might have formed the basis of the current Malaysian claim. These are new claims, something that didn't exist in the 1970s, do now. But they're worth taking, those factors are worth taking into account when you judge the position on the South China Sea. The law of the sea, except in the form that it took in 1958, I think it was still a very tenuous sort of creature, perhaps appropriate for a sea creature. It hadn't yet become fixed in the minds of lawyers and diplomats in the form it has today. So the law of the sea was beginning to indicate that there might be problems over issues such as special economic zones, exclusive economic zones, and similar sorts of claims that were extending what had been up till 1958, the standard 12-mile territorial waters limit. Now that all began to be in flux. And the first signs of that flux were, curiously enough, to my knowledge, not around the South China Sea, but around the East China Sea, over what we now call the Senkakus or the Diaoyutai Islands, depending on which side we're favouring at any one time. There were major shipping areas now through the South China Sea, and it was a major fishing area. It had always been a fishing area. That was one reason why you had both Chinese and Vietnamese claims, because Chinese and Vietnamese fishermen had fished in the same waters, and from those incidents had developed the national claims towards the islands. There were for many years there were very few clashes, there were very few points of tension. All the claims stood, but nobody pushed them forward. Then the Chinese began to behave a little more actively, but they were not the only ones. There was much interest in increasing the gain from the resources of the seas, and there was much interest in establishing a physical presence. So you start getting the competition for islands, if you like, but even that had its precedence. It goes back to the 1950s. The other thing I think about the position today is that for 20 years or so, China and the United States had a reasonably good or a developing relationship that looked hopeful. That turned in 1989, and it has never really got back to anything like the relationship there was, particularly during the early 1980s. China-US hostility, and I think you can't really put it in any other way, has grown as each side sees the other as the barrier to their interests. And the United States has certainly moved from its original position of not taking sides in a dispute into a much more active role. It still says the dispute should be settled peacefully, but by its actions and by its links with the countries of Southeast Asia, it is actually taking a side, as the Chinese see it, against China. And the very fact of US interest and US hostility as perceived to China has encouraged Southeast Asian nations to be more active in their own, what they see as their own interest. And it's not just that the United States sees its interests as concerned, it's now beginning increasingly to present itself almost as a party to the dispute. Recent statements and recent activities by the US Department of Defense and the Navy are quite worrying in their long-term implications for what the United States hints it might do in the South China Sea if there isn't a peaceful resolution to the problems. Now, the EU. Well, the EU position is not a terribly strong one. But I'm sure the ambassador will be able to beef up what both of us have said. The statement issued by the EU High Representative on the recent escalation of tensions in the South China Sea in May 2014 is, frankly, a series of platitudes. We urge all parties concerned to seek peaceful and cooperative solutions in accordance with international law, in particular the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and to continue ensuring safety and freedom of navigation. You couldn't argue with that. We call on everybody to de-escalating measures and refrain from any unilateral action which would be detrimental to peace and stability in the region. How could you disagree? Well, and here's the real killer point. The EU will keep following these developments closely. Good. This, you'll be pleased to know that the British government did support this. And we urge all parties to exercise restraint and to seek to de-escalate the situation. Now, clearly the EU is concerned about what happens in the South China Sea. Any conflict anywhere is, which could interfere with trade is bad, and in general, believe it or not, the EU is against conflict. It's not going to, as my colleague here has said, it's not going to intervene. I have actually heard a former senior official say that Britain should send gunboats to East Asia and they would be welcomed by countries like China. I won't tell you who he was, but he worked for Jardine Matheson, which was a bit worrying in many ways. We're not going to send forces to the South China Sea, and I don't think that would be a good move anyway. I think the less outsiders get involved in some ways, the better. But we can perhaps be more active in encouraging diffusing the situation, in counselling, and we can draw on our own experience of reaching agreements and of solving problems. But, you know, you have to be a little careful. Most countries do not, especially former colonial countries or countries that think they suffered at the hands of imperialism, like the Chinese do, they do not take kindly to being given lessons from a continent that just 60 years ago was had just finished tearing itself apart. You have to be very careful in how you present your case. Thank you.